Is Demira Scaminator the best deck in Legacy right now? My name is Matt. Let's take a look at last week in Legacy, or I guess in this case, last month in Legacy. We're going to look at February's deck list results and the metagame from Magic Online in Legacy. As always, we're going to take a look at the league results first. The league results, as always, like I always say, these are only representative of what does well in leagues. We don't know what that overall metagame was. We don't know what these matchups were played. All we know is what did well. That said, this is a pretty crazy result. This is the highest I think I've seen since I started tracking the data at the beginning of 2024. Demira Scaminator with 16.4% of results, a total of 31 5-0s over the course of the last week and a bit, which is wild. This deck was barely played at the beginning of February, and now it is double the next most played deck, which is like wild levels of growth. I don't think we've seen an explosion in a deck's popularity in a long time. I think that this beat Turbo Goblin's explosion in the beginning of January as well. We've got Grixis Delver after that, almost 7.5% of the metagame. Turbo Goblin's down to 5.33%, along with lands and the blue green white X Beans decks, along with Temur Delver. Blue green white X Beans has been a lot less popular than Salt Eye Beans has for a long time, but of course with Triumph of St. Catherine just being printed, I think a lot of people are moving on to the white versions of the Beans decks this past week to experiment and see if it's all that it's cracked up to be. So it makes sense that Salt Eye Beans is less popular this week. We've also got like regular dedicated reanimator decks. We've got Boros Initiative, Painter, all between 3 and 4% of the metagame. Mono Black Aggro and Doomsday are both just over 2.5%. And then this one was pretty weird. I hadn't seen Jeskai Delver in a long time, but there were several Jeskai Delver decks piloted by top Magic Online pilots. These lists looked like they mostly consisted of like Delver of Secrets, Dragon's Rage Channeler, and 4th Earlingus, but no Stoneforge Mystic. I think there was one list that had Stoneforge Mystic in it. So interesting to see that version of a Delver deck come back. White removal, I think, is very good right now, and it's especially very good against some of the top decks in the format. Creative Technique has also gotten quite a few interesting tools. Not so many like new powerful tools, as much as the deck has been streamlined so that it can go off on turn 2 or 3, where before you really had to wait until you had 6 mana in play. So turn 3, turn 4. So the deck's a lot scarier now. Definitely be packing those Damping Spheres. Looking at our overall metagame, the sort of like top of the field, yeah, Demira Scaminator, Grixis Delver, Turbo Goblins, lands, and then Beans, Delver, Reanimator make up almost like half of the field. And then we've got a smattering of small other archetypes, and then there's a bunch of like other smaller ones that are lumped together into the other category. Metagame's kind of interesting. We'll see what happens with Demira Scaminator. I kind of think that it's going to be preyed on by the blue-green white X Beans decks, where Salt Eye Beans isn't able to punish them in the same way without white removal, but I could be wrong about that. We'll sort of see how that plays out over the next couple of weeks. Moving on, let's look at the one specifically interesting list that I came across. So this is a Demira Scaminator deck by Uberdub. It's a 5-0 list from February 22nd from a league. And this, I think, is cool. So I've talked a little bit about this before, or maybe I've written about it. Either way, one of the things that we look at when we see these Scaminator lists is that their A plan and their B plan both have levels of graveyard reliance. So both the Entomb Reanimate plans alongside the Grief Reanimate plans or Grief Animate plans. And so having the sideboard, something like Dauthi Voidwalker or Murktide Regent is really good, but the big threat, the Murktide Regent, is also a graveyard synergy card, which, while most people are still playing Surgicals and Fairy Macabres, there are more Rest in Peace and more Leyline of the Voids in people's sideboards these days, and so having a threat that you can sort of bypass the that you can bypass that graveyard interaction with is, I think, pretty helpful. And while Triumph still does have some graveyard interactions where when it dies, you get to shuffle it back, sometimes you don't necessarily care about the shuffle it back portion. All you care about is, do I have a 5/5? Um, and so I think that that's a really cool way to sort of bypass that, where otherwise these decks were kind of cold to a ley line out of the board, and it would have to grind through it with just hardcast Grief and Bowmasters, which is not necessarily where you want to be. Whale of the Forgotten is another card that I really like in these lists. So Whale of the Forgotten, it just has a lot of utility. I could actually see trimming some number of ponders for it. That might be crazy, but it has a lot of utility, and the deck is pretty mana efficient, but once it it uses every single card in the 60, and so I wonder if the marginal downside of it costing additional mana to use the cantrip effect is worth the upside of having the other effect of being able to bounce a non-land permanent or make your opponent discard a card. I don't know, something to think about. And then there's a one of Hogak. And so this was something that we saw in the original Black Red Rescaminator deck from Prague, I think it was the one of Hogak to entomb for, where you can just entomb Hogak and then just cast it. Um, Hogak, I think, is really, really good as a one of in the main deck to add an additional sort of fair-ish game plan, where most of the time opponents may not be able to interact with, or they might be holding a counter spell, but they might counter they might want to counter the Animate Dead instead of your Entomb, so you can just like Entomb Hogak, and then they can try and counter the Hogak, but then you just cast it again. Um, Hogak seems pretty good. This is something that I thought was pretty free to add into this deck, so I'm curious. I have all of these cards in paper, so I think I might put this together and play it at FNM some week. This list looks pretty good. I really like where this player has gone with the addition of the new cards. Looking at our combined February Legacy results, we've got again, Rescaminator has just picked up so much steam. It was almost 10% of the overall metagame for the entire month, even though it was barely played the first week, which means that it's really taken off in weeks 2 through 4. Turbo Goblin's still a top deck, almost at 9%. Grixis Delver just under 7%. Temur Delver at just under 5.5%. Salty Beans around 5%. And Reanimator down all the way down to 4.6. This is a lot lower than it was in January. Lands, Blue Green White X Beans, Mono Black Aggro, Doomsday, and Creative Technique are all sort of about where you might expect them to be. Moonstompy, Stifle and Boros Initiative are also lower than they had been in previous months, as well as Dimir Scam. But I think that makes total sense because people have moved from Dimir Scam onto Dimir Scaminator. Let's take a look at sort of the prelim and challenges. So the prelim and challenge results are where we get a little bit more information, a little bit more insight into how decks have done and how they are likely to continue doing, or sort of gives us more information to draw on. The way that I assess these is looking at the conversion rate, expected quantity to convert into a positive record, and then the sort of difference between the number that we expected to have positive records versus the number that did, and then building out a percentage based on that. And those are the ways that I like to visualize how well decks are performing. So the most popular decks in the challenges and prelims this past week were Dimir Scaminator and Turbo Goblins, both around 30 copies. Dimir Scaminator slightly higher, but not a crazy amount more. Basically, both between 10 and 11% of the field. Turbo Goblins put up a better record here, so it had a conversion rate of almost 40% versus an expected conversion rate of 34, whereas Dimir Scaminator only had a conversion rate of 26 versus, yeah, the expected 34. So this is an underperformance from Dimir Scaminator. Something to keep in mind, though, is that it overperformed in the prior 2 weeks by a lot, and the prior, like the exact prior 1 week had a lot more players. We'll look at that on the next slide, but often when a lot of players pick up a deck, the performance of that deck drops as they aren't necessarily as familiar or practiced with that deck. Grixis Delver also had a pretty bad week, so surprisingly only converted 20% of pilots. That is a very poor performance out of Grixis Delver, which is very consistent normally. A very consistent overperformer normally. Reanimator itself also did reasonably well, overperforming by about 13%. It's kind of interesting. So Reanimator split into some different versions. Now that we've got the Rescaminator versions, we've got people playing Dimir, like dedicated Dimir Reanimator. We've got people playing the black-green version with Worldly Tutor and the Surveil lands. Those are kind of cool. We've got a lot of Witherbloom combo out of sideboards. There's still a lot of different versions of Reanimator, so it hasn't settled now that people are on Dimir Rescaminator as well. The blue-green white X Beans decks also didn't super perform very well, but again, Triumph just came out, and I think it would be too soon to expect the player base to both have bought all of these cards yet, considering that a playset of Triumphs costs 160 USD plus taxes, and that metagames take time to shift. Like, yeah, I expect that we'll see more beans in the long term, but it's not surprising that it hasn't shown up yet. Lands really, really overperformed. I think that this makes sense. Lands is really good against the sort of like mid-rangey decks, Delver, the Beans decks. I think that it's probably pretty good against Rescaminator as well. I haven't played that matchup myself yet, but if they're able to hold up a Bajuka Bog or some such thing, then they can prevent themselves from dying. And because the Dimir Scaminator decks are not fast, they're fast, but they're not fast mana fast, if that makes sense. They are more able to be interacted with by something like Lands. So it's not surprising that Lands is doing very well. Lands did the absolute best of pretty much any deck this week, other than Creative Technique, but that's a much smaller sample size. We have Initiative doing okay. We have Teamer Delver doing okay. Teamer Delver is within like a margin of sort of like what I would say that's within a margin of error. Basically, it's like 2.73. You would round that up to three players converted. Therefore, that's an expected result. Interesting how poorly Painter did, despite Painter also getting access to Chaos Defiler this week. Painter only converting 1 pilot out of 10. It's pretty bad. Let's look at the month as a whole. So yeah, looking at February as a whole, week over week metagame, and in our prelims and challenge events, our sort of top decks of the month, I think, were Grixis Delver, Dimir Scaminator, and Lands. These are all decks that performed quite well while also maintaining reasonable metagame share. Reanimator, Moonstompy, Salty Beans, and D&T also all had like sort of consistent or net positive results. Decks that underperformed by some or quite a lot were Painter, Green-White X Steps, Boros Initiative, Blue-Green-White X Beans, Doomsday, and then Teamer Delver. Interesting how Teamer Delver has really become a dog by comparison to Grixis Delver, where it wins the Delver Mirrors because of the card advantage bypassing Bowmasters, but it, I guess, is not nearly as good against everything else because it doesn't have Bowmasters. One thing I want to mention here is the Demira Scaminator and Scion Beans decks. These uh, these percentage deviation from expected results are weighted a little bit differently than the other decks on this list are. There were some weeks where these decks weren't played at all, so Scion Beans only first popped up on the week of the 15th to the 21st ish of February. And so I didn't wait weeks 1 and 2 for that deck, but instead have more heavily weighted weeks 2 and 3 for its results. And then the same goes for Demir Scaminator. There were no players who played Rescaminator in the first week of February, and so again, I've just weighted weeks 2, 3, and 4 slightly more heavily. Not in like an arbitrary way, just in a like we're taking basically for Rescaminator, instead of it being a a total field size of almost 1,000, we weighted a field of 114 for week 2, 427 for week 3, and then 275 for week 4. And that is the total, which we then use to create the weightings, instead of the whole month, if that makes sense. Uh, but yeah, I mean, this this format looks pretty interesting. I am a little bit concerned about how quickly and sort of like how quickly Demira Scaminator has just popped up. I don't know if this is just a deck of the week, like flavor of the week kind of a thing. I think that there are ways to hate this out, but also as a hybrid deck, as a powerful, like very truly hybrid deck, it, it can be pretty difficult to like beat in a dedicated way. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Even though it didn't do as well this past week, it was still sort of like the third best performing deck of the month. I don't know. Let me know what you think. I'm sorry if my analysis today has not been as good as it has been in prior weeks. I just got I'm on the mend from being sick, but I was laid out for like 3 days, which is why this is several days late. Um, so thank you all for your patience. Um, and yeah, please let me know what you think, both of the metagame and of my thoughts. If you want to catch some more, click the subscribe button so that you can get notified when I have something new. Or if you want to check out the previous weeks in Last Week in Legacy, click on the playlist. Thank you so much for spending the time with me today.